Haley, and I wanted to talk about electing officers in the California Legislature. As you probably know, in the California Legislature, there are officers of each house, and those officers are actually elected by the members of either the Assembly or the Senate for respective House positions, and then there are also some that are joint. And rules related to these elections can be found in our state constitution, the California Government Code, the rules of the Assembly and Senate, and of course the joint rules of the two houses. So for example, in Article 4 that deals with the legislative branch of government of the California Constitution, it provides in Section 7A that each house shall choose its officers. Now, nothing further is provided related to choosing the officers in the California Constitution, but Section 7C4 specifies that political party caucuses may meet in closed session. Turning to the Government Code, the California Government Code provides for the election of officers, and then a majority vote is required for those elected to these positions. First, there's Government Code Section 9020 that requires the legislature to convene its session on the first Monday in December and quote unquote immediately organize. This, of course, includes the election of officers. The Senate is described in Section 9022, while the Assembly is described in Section 9023. There's also Government Code Section 9170 that actually provides that the officers and employees of the California State Senate are a president, who's the lieutenant governor by the Constitution, a president pro tem, a secretary, a sergeant at arms, a minute clerk, and a chaplain, and then any other officers and employees that are deemed by the Senate to be necessary, and those would be provided in a Senate resolution. The officers and employees that are set forth that I just mentioned are elected by a majority vote of the senators who have been duly elected and are qualified. So 21 votes, assuming all 40 senators are seated, are required to elect the officers of the Senate. In turning to Government Code Section 9171, it provides for the officers and employees of the Assembly and says that there's a speaker pro tem, a majority floor leader, a minority floor leader, a chief clerk, a sergeant at arms, a minute clerk, and a chaplain. And then, like its Senate counterpart, other officers or employees that the Assembly deems necessary, and those are provided in a resolution adopted by the Assembly. Now, the officers and employees I mentioned, except for the majority leader, the minority leader, and the minute clerk, are elected by a majority vote of the duly elected and qualified members of the Assembly, which obviously would be 41, assuming all 80 members of the Assembly are seated. So 41 is what's required to elect the officers of the Assembly, assuming a full contingent of 80 members. Finally, in the Government Code, there's Section 9173 that specifies any officer or employee appointed or elected by the Senate or the Assembly may at any time be removed in the same manner as provided for that person's election or appointment. In other words, it takes the same majority vote generally to remove an officer in the Senate or Assembly. I next wanted to tackle the rules in what happens at the beginning of each two-year session is the Senate adopts a Senate resolution, an SR, that's relative to the standing rules of the Senate. And then it says that on the first day of each session, the president pro tem, members of the Rules Committee, the Secretary of the Senate, and the Senate Sergeant at Arms are elected by majority vote of the duly elected and qualified senators. So, for example, in the 21-22 session, Senate Resolution 2 was relating to the election of officers. And it said, resolved by the Senate of the state of California that Senator Tony G. Atkins be and is hereby elected President pro tem of the Senate, that Erica Contreras Vallis be and is hereby elected Secretary of the Senate, and that Katrina Rodriguez be and is hereby elected Sergeant at Arms of the Senate. In the Assembly, the Assembly adopted House Resolution 1 that adopted the standing rules of the Assembly for the session. And Assembly Rule 1 deals with the officers and provides all of them. And so election of the Speaker occurs at the convening of a new session, which occurs at noon on the first Monday in December of the even-numbered year, and it is actually the first order of business. And then the Assembly adopts a resolution. For the 21-22 session, it was House Resolution 2 by Speaker Rendon that was adopted relative to the election of the officers for the 2-year session, and it read that resolved by the Assembly of the State of California that the following named persons constitute the officers of the Assembly: Sue Parker, the Chief Clerk; Elisa Buckley, the Chief Sergeant at Arms; and Imam Mohammed Yasir Khan is the chaplain of the Assembly. So officers of both houses of the legislature are elected by a majority of their peers, and of course serve at the pleasure of that same majority. So those are the officers of the California Assembly who are elected for each 2-year legislative session.